The vault was not supposed to be there. My name is Sarah Voss. I was a field medic, 3rd rotation, assigned to the excavation and survey station on Thresh 6. The colony moon everyone called the shelf because of the way its rock strata ran in flat, gray shelves from the equator to the pole, clean and layered as old paper. It was not a military post, technically, though it had a military flavor. Armed survey teams, a contract garrison of 60 soldiers, and the usual tension between contractors who wanted to dig fast and colonial authority observers who wanted to dig carefully, treated injuries from both sides without preference. The triage bay occupied the station's lowest occupied level. Below it, accessible only through a service hatch in the floor of the equipment room, was the sub-level corridor that led to the vault. The soldiers had found it 8 months before I arrived. 4 of them had gone down on a dare, bored men with too much time between rotations. The first to touch the far wall came back up with both palms blistered to the bone. The second reached for the object at the room's center, a blade laid flat on a raised stone table, and the burn began before his fingers made contact, a heat that came from the air itself. He lost 2 fingers before the others dragged him out. The third never touched anything and came back up pale and would not speak for 4 days. After that, the service hatch was sealed with a proximity lock and a standing order, and the vault became a ghost story that the garrison told over food and nobody investigated. Because no one wanted liability for a second incident. I had been on Thresh 6 for 11 weeks when the cave-in happened. It was a fault collapse in the northern excavation corridor, a routine structural failure of the kind the shelf produced regularly. Nothing dramatic, but it buckled 3 levels of prefab flooring and dropped a section of the equipment room floor into the sub-level below. I was already in the equipment room when it went, pulling gauze rolls from a supply shelf, and the drop took me with it. I fell 8 feet and landed badly on my left side, cost me 2 cracked ribs and my composure for about 30 seconds. When I found my light, I was in the sub-level corridor. The hatch above was gone. The collapse had taken the frame with it, and what remained was a 4-meter drop of raw stone, with no footholds and no I called up twice and heard nothing. The dust was still settling, which meant the collapse had not finished, and the smart thing was to stay low and wait for the structure to stabilize before I tried anything that might shift more weight. I had been in worse situations, I told myself that, with some conviction, and pressed my back against the corridor wall and breathed through the pain. In my ribs, the corridor was perhaps 12 meters long, ending in the vault room. I had my field light. The air was cold and stale in the way of sealed places. Not the cold of ventilation, but the cold of enclosure. Something that had been shut away so long, the air inside, it had settled into a kind of permanence, the way water in a sealed jar becomes still beyond the memory of motion. A soldier was in the vault room. He had been caught by the collapse. A young man from the eastern garrison, Pel Doran, 22 years old, whom I knew by face from the meal line. He was pinned from the knee down under a section of fallen stone, conscious, in the specific way of someone who knows their situation is bad and is working to keep that knowledge at a manageable distance. I went to him immediately because that is what I was, and nothing in the room mattered more than the man who was hurt. The vault room was perhaps 10 meters square, the ceiling low, the walls cut from the shelf's gray stone with a precision that no natural process produced. The floor was smooth. The seams in the stonework were fine as thread. In the room's center stood the altar, a single block of pale stone, waist high, with a blade laid flat across it. The blade was long, broader toward the tip than the hilt, made of some material that was not metal and was not stone, but carried the visual weight of both. The surface was dark and dull except for a tracery, inscription along both edges. Lines of notation so fine they might have been hair until you looked carefully and saw that each line was deliberate, exact, recursive, the kind of writing that accrues over generations rather than being made in a single session. The blade had not burned me when I entered. I noticed this the way you notice the absence of pain, as information, not comfort. I did not go near the altar. I went to Pel Doran and I worked. His leg was intact under the stone, which was weight without edge, and I spent 20 minutes assessing and repositioning and talking him level while I figured out whether I could shift the fallen section. It was too heavy, to lift but possible to lever, and I needed something rigid and long enough to give me distance. The only object of sufficient length in the room was the altar itself, or rather the blade lying on it. I told myself I was not going to touch it. Then I looked at Peldoran's face and I picked up the blade. My hands closed around the hilt and I felt nothing. No heat, no pain, no force. The blade was lighter than it should have been, and warmer than the air in a way that suggested function rather than temperature, the way a living hand is warmed differently from a heated stone. I used the flat of it as a lever, braced against the rubble, shifted the fallen section 6 inches. Enough. Peldoran pulled his leg free and I set the blade down on the altar and went back to him. I had my hands on his calf, checking for fracture, when the vault woke. There was no sound I could identify as a source. It was a vibration that arrived through the floor, and through the altar, and through the air simultaneously, low and vast, the way the resonance of a struck bell is everywhere in the room, rather than only at the bell. The inscription along the blade's edges ignited, not flame but light, the deep violet of a lineage reveal, moving outward from the hilt, along both edges in a slow wave that did not stop at the blade's tip but continued into the air of the room, tracing the same lines in the stone floor that I had not seen before. The same notation repeated in the rock beneath our feet, filling the vault wall to wall with the pattern that had been there, waiting, for a length of time I did not know how to hold in my mind. The altar rose 3 inches on its own authority. The blade turned slowly until the hilt faced me, and then, through the stone, through the floor, through the arches of my feet, the relic spoke, not in sound, in frequency and resonance, in a vibration that bypassed the ear and arrived directly in the chest as meaning, the way a cannon fired close reports itself in the body before the mind has processed the noise. Rise, last armorer. I did not move. The inscription continued to burn its slow violet along the stone. Peldoran had gone very still beside me, and I was aware of him distantly, the way I was aware of the cold and the dust. As facts at the edge of a much larger fact that was pressing inward from every direction. I had always understood myself as a woman with no inheritance worth naming, an ordinary record, an ordinary name, hands trained to close wounds and keep people who were hurt from becoming people who were dead. I had not known that 60 centuries ago, someone had placed a vault in the stone of a world not yet found, laid a blade on an altar, written in lines, so fine they were invisible until needed the name of the one allowed to lift it. The blade had not burned me. I looked at my hands. They were steady. There was dried blood on the left one from Peldoran's leg, and the skin beneath was clean and unburned and entirely ordinary. That was the thing I could not stop looking at. Whatever I was, whatever line I carried without knowing I carried it, whatever the vault had waited in the dark of the shelf stone to say to it, found me through the oldest door available. A man pinned under rubble, and a pair of hands that did not hesitate. I reached out and closed my fingers around the hilt a second time. The inscription burned brighter and did not speak again, because it did not need to. It had already said the only thing it had held in silence for 6,000 years, and the saying of it had changed every fact about who I was and what my hands were for. Stood in that vault, a long time after Peldoran was helped out, after the rescue team found the corridor and called down for me, after they lowered a rope and called my name. I stood there with the blade in my hands and tried to become the person it had always known I was.